Regarding Men, episode 49. Can Harvey Weinstein get a fair trial?
Well, hello there. I'm Janice Fiamengo, and I'm joined with my ever-present, ever-wonderful co-hosts, Paul Elam and Tom Golden. And without any further ado, we're going to get to the very meaty subject of our discussion today, which is the trial of Harvey Weinstein. And that trial is beginning this week. I think the latest news was that jury selection has been completed. And I think the last thing I saw was that there is an expert witness being called by the prosecution to immediately wrong foot the defense. And the defense, of course, is going to argue that these particular relationships were, well, there's only two of them, that which is interesting in itself, that out of the 80 plus or even 90 plus accusers of Harvey Weinstein, only two are going to actually face him in a criminal court. I think there are a number of others, maybe a dozen or so, who are suing him in civil court, where, of course, the burden of proof is much lower. So that's interesting in itself, too. Originally, as I understand it, there were three accusers, but one of them was disqualified in a very dubious and actually worrisome situation. This was, I think, Lucia, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Evans, who claimed that she was raped by Harvey Weinstein. A witness came forward to say that the complainant had actually told her that she had not been raped by Harvey. This witness was it's not clear, but either the police officer who interviewed this witness never took it forward to the Crown, or the Crown suppressed the witness's statements. And this finally
Just a point of clarification, we actually don't have the Crown.
Oh, you don't have. Sorry, right. The prosecution. Yeah. Oh boy,
we
not a good start.
We know what you meant.
Trivial difference.
Don't listen to
Yeah.
Elam.
Thanks for correcting that. Anyway, and so the prosecution declares that they never got the evidence. The police officer says that he did give it to them, and not clear what happened there, but it certainly indicates something perhaps about the zeal with which Harvey Weinstein is being pursued. And so we'll get into some of those issues perhaps a little bit later. Now, Weinstein, of course, is a fascinating case because he's the face of Me Too, really. Yes. He is perhaps the most hated man in Hollywood or in our popular culture today. Whether he is found guilty or not in this trial, he's ruined personally, financially, professionally. He was really, he's the one that everybody is convinced, even sort of sober commentators are happy to have seen him taken down. There are very few people willing to say, well, we have to let him have his day in court. And the case is an interesting one because it reveals all sorts of things about this contemporary cultural moment, really. And although I'm willing to say that Harvey Weinstein doesn't look good in all of the proceedings, I have to say that the accusers don't look very good either. And in fact, that the whole thing stinks and raises all sorts of moral and legal questions. So let's dive in.
I want to say something right up front that just needs to be said, and that is that Harvey Weinstein is innocent. We have a presumption of innocent. And before we launch into this conversation, I want to just point out for a moment what that actually means. It doesn't mean that we kind of give Harvey Weinstein the benefit of the doubt. It literally means that we have to assume in legal terms that Harvey was walking down the street minding his own business, and the state, for no reason whatsoever, grabs him off the street and charges him with a crime he did not commit. That is what presumption of innocence means. It means the state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he is guilty of this crime. And what I've seen already in reading a motion to dismiss was something very familiar to these cases, which is the defense claims to be in possession of emails from his accusers that are pointing to a much more intimate, familiar relationship after the alleged rape.
Miss you, big guy.
It stinks.
Yeah.
Miss you, big guy.
Sure,
That was one of the messages.
does. Yeah.
No, I have talked to some actual rape victims, women, and I never heard one of them sending messages to their rapist saying, miss you, big guy.
Yeah.
This is not the behavior, but what I sense from this, and that motion to dismiss was dismissed. It was thrown out by the judge. It appears in this, and for, I think, obvious reasons, that there are political motivations to convict this man, that there is the Me Too impetus, the judge, I'm sure, looking at his career. What if he doesn't have a conviction on the face of Me Too?
Uh-oh.
Those emails
Not
from
good.
women saying, miss you, big guy, stuff like that. I'm thinking, man, they're just gonna like maybe suppress that. And I want to give everybody else a chance to talk, but I want to come back to that particular subject in a few minutes that relates to some other things.
It's critical. There was another one, Paul. There's no one else I would enjoy catching up with that understands me quite like you do.
Yeah.
Rapists are known for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's
like, wait a minute.
Wow.
And the whole thing that bugs me too is this whole believe the victim stuff. You know, that we've been saturated with the idea you believe the victim no matter what. It's like, if you don't, then you're betraying her. Like, this is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
And it goes against, common sense, and it goes against the research too about what actually happens to people. You know, they talk in the believe the victim stuff about how, well, it might be that she's fuzzy about what happened, and it might be she doesn't remember. But the fact is, if you look at the research about trauma, that people who are traumatized remember more than people who are not traumatized. They tend to remember everything, in this detail.
Memories that plagued them.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so, it seems to me like they're taking just the feminist science and applying that to the courtroom, and that's dangerous.
And I'm surprised they haven't come up with some sort of Stockholm syndrome explanation for why these alleged victims now want intimate, close personal contact with their alleged rapist.
Yes.
But it must be some sort of empathy for your perpetrator.
Yeah, well, they have in a sense. I mean, not exactly Stockholm syndrome in terms of empathy, but you often hear feminist advocates, or even just, I don't suppose Gloria Allred is particularly a feminist, but she's representing one of the complainants, Mimi Halevi, I think her name is. And, she's already made that point that, yes, this woman carried on a very close personal relationship with Harvey Weinstein for years after the alleged rape, which took place in 2006, allegedly. Yet she carried on in very friendly terms, wanting to meet him, signing things, love and peace, and, all sorts of things. And that this is now put forward as a way that the victim is dealing with her trauma. So it isn't exactly love for her abuser, but she's masking the trauma. She's
I've
not.
worked with trauma victims for 30 years. I've never seen anything quite like that.
Yeah, that's bullshit on its face.
Yeah,
but it's now widely accepted. And this is, by the way, if anyone's interested in delving into some of the things we're talking about here, there is we'll include in the link associated with the video. This is from the motion to dismiss of Harvey Weinstein's earlier defense team, headed up by, what was his first name? Braffman is his last name. I forgot his first name. I wrote it down
Doesn't
somewhere.
matter.
It doesn't matter. Braffman was his head counsel for the defense. No longer now. He's got a different defense team. I think he's a very trying client. Obviously very obsessive. That was the way he was in all of his endeavors. Quite abusive, as it seems, to men and women. Very insistent, very aggressive. Well, he's like that with his defense counsel too. But this is available as a PDF online. It's a very lengthy overview of the defense case, including the emails that Weinstein has from the two complainants. And it is pretty hard to imagine these two as victims carrying on this kind of intimate, loving, ongoing relationship where they are active participants in the relationship.
And there is a question here too, which scares me. There's a question now with rape shield laws, whether a lot of this stuff will ever be admitted for his defense. And I go back to the case of Marv Albert. Some of you may remember. He was a very famous sportscaster in basketball, probably considered one of the all-time greats. He got involved with a woman, and part of their relationship involved rough sex, biting, other things that they got into mutually and with consent on both parts. She was also known to be vindictive when men broke up with her. And Albert broke up with her because he had decided to marry another woman. She made a rape allegation. Albert had this woman's former boyfriend that was prepared to testify that that she was vindictive when they broke up and made up false accusations about him, and two, that biting and rough sex was a part of their repertoire in the bedroom, and that was her preference. The judge refused to allow any of this into evidence because of rape shield laws, because we're so going to protect now the woman's sexual history that we don't want the jury to take that into account. But this was exculpatory evidence.
Right.
And the judge did not allow it. Albert was forced to take a plea bargain, which essentially had him convicted of a sex crime, ruining his life, destroying him forever. And I mentioned this case is many, many years old at this point, but I mentioned it because he's another famous individual. This happens to men all the time. Elizabeth or Meredith, I forget, Pagurny, in a rape trial in New York, lied about a guy. Her admission that the sex was consensual was kept out of court. He went to prison for 4 years, where he was assaulted by other inmates because he was a rapist and seriously injured, spent 4 years in prison. And eventually she admitted to it, and she wound up for a few months in prison. But this stuff happens regularly, and I can see it happening to Harvey Weinstein right now with no problem.
Yeah. And we know that the prosecution has already brought in this expert witness, Ziv, her last name is, to say that this behavior on the part of the victims is absolutely normal and must not be used to discredit them in any way. So essentially, if that is accepted, then there is no defense.
Right.
If there is no way, because obviously there is no evidence, there's no physical evidence from assaults that took place decades ago in some cases, or years ago in the case of the other, I think it's a 2013 alleged offense is the second complainant. So there's no physical evidence. There is no other kind of evidence except how the complainant behaved with the accused. And if we're supposed to accept that whatever the complainant did is absolutely typical of a rape victim, even if she carried on a happy sexual relationship with her rapist, even if she wrote to him constantly saying how much she loved him and how much she was looking forward to seeing him again and chatting with him, and So, it's really quite startling. It's the same kind of cutting off of the defense at the knees that was used in the Bill Cosby trial.
Right.
And we saw that it was successful there. And it is really, I just find it, I don't think it can be overstated how astounding it is. What it is essentially saying is that these women are liars. That's how they cope with life, with their own behavior. They have lied to themselves. They have lied to their closest friends. They have lied to their alleged abuser. Yet now we're supposed to believe they're not lying.
Of course. And
Wow.
it's also, I think, important to point out that the behavior of both parties in these situations, as it likely went down, was very typical for what goes on in Hollywood. You have producers all the time handing out roles in exchange for sex.
Right.
That's been the Hollywood way for decades and decades and decades. That's why you have young aspiring starlets bussing into Hollywood every year in droves, looking to make those deals, and men willing to make those deals. One might even argue, if you want to take a Evo psych look at it, that this is it's a microcosm of relationships between men and women and how they typically happen.
Yes.
And I don't think there's any arguing that, but on the other side of this, the legal sense, this is why, and I've been criticized for it roundly in many media sources, why I advocate the concept of jury nullification. When the system is stacked so that you cannot get due process, that you cannot get a fair trial. Thomas Jefferson said that the jury trial was the only instrument yet known to man by which a people can hold their government to the principles of its constitution. And this is why jury nullification is such a profound thing. If you can't get a fair trial in a rape case anymore, it's very hard.
It sure is.
For a defendant to get a fair trial. And if they're bringing in experts to telling you that her having sex with him 75 times after the so-called rape is evidence of rape,
Yeah.
then there's enough there for me to call bullshit and vote not guilty.
It's very, you make a very compelling case. I mean, it really is startling. I agree. I mean, now what they're doing too is they're bringing in other witnesses. The prosecution are bringing in other witnesses to say that he raped them as well or behaved in similar ways in order to establish this kind of pattern, which was also what was used in the Bill Cosby trial, if I'm understanding that one correctly. And so, I mean, it's crazy in that they are not willing to come forward, or maybe can't because statute of limitations, but they're not actually complainants in the case. And yet we are supposed to treat them as credible witnesses. And I mean, if we believe that a woman's sexual history should not be used against her in a trial, in a rape trial, even if we believe that some of these women, what they're saying is true, if they seem credible, etc., what bearing could that possibly have on whether he is guilty in these particular instances that he is being tried for? And yet it seems that that is now also an acceptable prosecution strategy for which he has no defense.
Right.
So
It's the
so
smoke
wrong.
and mirrors you provide when forensic evidence isn't going to make your case.
Yeah.
And I think we have to admit that in rape cases, even in fresh rape cases, forensic evidence can be difficult. I don't think that we can't be in such denial that we can't admit how difficult this is. And at the same time, that's the cost of a system of jurisprudence that involves due process.
Yes.
Some people will slip through the cracks. It's sad, it's tragic, it's unfortunate. But as I said, rather than starting to incarcerate everybody who's accused, we have to rely on due process.
It used to be better that 10 guilty men go free than that one innocent man be unjustly imprisoned. The feminist position is better that 100 men go to prison, 100 innocent men rather go to prison, than that one accuser hesitate to come forward. You know, it's become...
Oh boy. Then you add on to all of this the likelihood that false accusation is prevalent in many rape cases. It's just, if you look at Canaan's work and the work of others, it's
You know, Bloomberg just released a video of their coverage of ICMI in Chicago.
Oh, they did.
And
Oh.
in that, and matter of fact, we'll put a link to that below so that everybody can watch it. And they covered discussions with me and with Karen Strawn and others. And it showed them going through one feminist canard after another, including not just the wage gap and the totally nonsensical notion that more women and girls are physically assaulted in our society than men and boys, but also that 2% of false accusation of accusations were false, which is a statistic with no real source that any feminist will ever really provide.
Yeah.
And we have Canaan's work and the work of McDonald and others that put this more realistically at 40 to 50% false accusations.
Yep.
But of course, that doesn't stop feminists from,
of course not,
parroting the canards.
Yeah. And if you look at the, what's the name of the group that takes people who are falsely accused and pulls them out of prison? The
Innocence Project.
Innocence Project is
most
almost,
of
I think
those
it's
are
75% are false rape
sexual
cases.
assault. Yeah.
And some of those, to be fair, are cases of, I did a little research on that there's a fair amount of those that are cases of mistaken identity and what have you. But somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 35% of those who are exonerated with DNA evidence, it was a matter of being lied about.
Yep.
And of course, feminists say there's 15 gazillion rapes a year. If 2% of those are false allegations, that's still...
It's an awful lot. Yeah.
It's an awful lot of people.
Yeah.
And if it's 50%, that's a gazillion guys who are being screwed.
And even the feminists have to admit, I mean, I've looked at those pro-feminist studies. Most of them say something like 2 to 8%. 8, you're already getting up into a pretty high number. And that's just the known cases. So, you know, that's the cases where the woman has confessed that she concocted the allegation.
Yes.
There are very few cases where someone actually confesses that they lied in terms of the overall number. So it is very, very disturbing to see this idea of female purity and female innocence and how that maintains its tenacious grip on our cultural mentality, even in these cases where, okay, let's accept, as probably is the case, that there was a lot of dodgy stuff going on. And that it certainly seems, I mean, we've all heard the recording made where Weinstein is begging this woman to come into his hotel room. And I mean, it hardly seems to me to be a sexual assault, but it indicates something off about his relationship with his sexuality, I would say. I don't know how one would diagnose it, but he seems desperate for this woman and can't bear the thought of her turning him down. So let's accept that he didn't behave like a gentleman. But all of these accounts, if you go back to the 2017 article by Ronan Farrell, which kind of, I think, was the beginning of the whole case, where multiple women told their stories. There's a couple things that really jump out at one. I mean, one is that if even a small fraction of these women had come forward many, many years ago, this would not have been able to go on. But this is a case of mass complicity on the part of women who freely confess they knew what was going on and yet stayed silent and were quite willing, it seems, for an awfully long time to sacrifice their own selves, if that's what they really did, as they claim, and to sacrifice many other women. Why? Just for stardom? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. And also their descriptions of their, the trauma, the how devastating it was. In some cases of alleged assault, but also in other cases where what he did was nowhere near a horrific rape, just objectionable comments or masturbating in their presence, things like that.
Exposing himself.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Okay, well, maybe you didn't like it. I cannot imagine that it would lead to tears and bulimia and trembling and I'm utterly unable to kind of recover from this horrific thing that happened. So, on the one hand, you have these incredibly successful, powerful, elite women. On the other hand, their confessions of unbelievable naivete, innocence, fragility, inability to say no, inability to say what they mean. I mean, which is it? And I keep thinking, if you really do regard your body as such a sacred vessel, that even a wayward touch is going to, cause years and years and years of psychological trauma, then why would you ever trade that for stardom? I don't see how it can be both at the same time. And yet that's what we're supposed to believe. And we're also supposed to believe that these women are mature and determined and successful and smart and everything else, but that they are somehow incapable of saying no to a man who pushes them. Well, again, which is it? I mean, I have trouble saying no. I know that is a thing, with both men and women. That's my issue. And I have learned how to say no, often with apologies. So what are we supposed to think then about these women? And how can we trust them and treat them as autonomous, fully adult, mature human beings when they tell us over and over again that they're not?
Well, I think one of the things that's very telling about this is that none of these accusers, the two that are involved in the criminal case now and most all of the others that were lined up, they're all living proof of one thing, that just because you have sex with Harvey Weinstein doesn't mean you can act. You never heard of any of them. None of them made it. And we're talking about women who have come out of the woodwork from decades ago with Gloria Allred in tow. A sure sign to me, when I see that sign, the tearful 50-something woman that was touched on her left breast 35 years ago, and she's crying for the cameras about it with someone like Gloria Allred with her, I see a liar. That's the first word that pops into my mind. I do not believe any of this.
I see dollar signs.
They were participating, to me. It's the most likely, the Occam's razor to this is that they were doing what young aspiring starlets do in Hollywood, and the expectation of Harvey Weinstein to be a gentleman in a culture, in a Hollywood culture that reveres Roman Polanski and other pedophiles, is like, who do we really think we're talking about here? In many ways, morally, Hollywood is a cesspool of very amoral people.
Yes.
And these women are part of that too. And now
that's it.
We've got the prosecutors and everybody treating them like they were virgins. Not buying it here.
I hear you. Yeah. Reminds me of the work of Tanya Reynolds, who looks at, who gets the compassion when they're victims. And over again, what she found was universally, cross cultures, it's the female that gets the compassion when they're victims. And it's even the female that gets compassion when she's the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so easy for these prosecutors to go in and do this, because it's like everyone will nod their head and say, oh, poor dear. You know, if it had been a man who has been prosecuted, they would have hang him, because she found also that men don't get the compassion.
Yeah.
You know, and when they're the perpetrators, they might as well just get thrown out the window. You know, so it's good. This research has basically shown us that what we've intuited for the last 20 or 30 years is really true. You know, a woman's pain is a call to action, and a man's pain is taboo.
And that we simply cannot accept the reality of female wrongdoing.
Exactly.
And
when we see it, we victimize her. We say, "Oh,
yeah, we say she was driven to it."
Female agency, you'll never be able to accept female wrongdoing.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so the very thing that, when it begins now to affect every man alive, to the extent that every man is vulnerable to false accusations and to the mass conspiracy to believe women, even when they're entirely lacking in credibility, it's a very worrisome thing.
Amen.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to believe, looking at this, I mean, and again, I don't know what happened in those rooms. I'll never know I don't think I'll ever know what happened, even regardless of the court case. But my inclination in this, if there's a victim, I'm inclined to think it's Harvey Weinstein more than these women making the accusations. So I know he's not, a very pitiable character. None of them are. But
well, that's certainly how his defense team now is saying that, and I think there's some sense to that. They used him. They saw that he was vulnerable to their manipulations. They used him for what they could get out of him.
Yes.
And this is the thing, we have decided to universally frown on what we call sexual harassment on the side of the man. But we don't frown on or do anything about or even recognize sexual exploitation on the part of the woman. Amen. Mostly because I guess most men who are victims of sexual exploitation, don't complain about it afterwards.
That's true.
Although some other women, may be resentful when it's obvious in an office setting or some professional setting that a woman is getting, is securing advances for herself and professional perks by using her sexuality. That is pretty irritating to other people around her to see her acting in that way. But we don't even have really a language to talk about the problem, and it does exist, and that seems to be, some of what has gone on in this.
It's called business as usual.
Yeah, business as usual. Yeah. So our moral condemnation is certainly all askew in these cases. Yeah.
This is a great tragedy. I think any time that you politicize something like the problem of sexual assault, that's a social problem, it's a legal problem. When you make it a political issue, all you do is create victims straight down the road. There may be real rape victims in this and you'd never know it. Just saying.
Yeah.
Too many people, too many high profile attorneys looking for camera time, twisting the truth, too many political agendas. I don't think these prosecutors want to dare have a chance that they're not going to get a conviction here, because then they'll be the people that let that terrible serial rapist go, no matter what. The same thing will befall the judge. So I think his chance for fair trial, not very good.
Sadly, not very good at all.
Yeah.
He deserves a fair trial,
Well,
yes, he does.
Scumbag or not.
The system, it's necessary for faith in the system. And yet most people seem to be quite willing to let it go, or a lot of people do anyway.
Yep.
Well, I no longer have faith in the system, and I think for good reason. I still hope this guy accidentally gets a fair trial and that some semblance of justice is done.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right.
And on that sad
On
note,
that note, we'll wish everyone a good week.
yep,
49 down the drain.
rooting for a good, peaceful day in Richmond
Yes.
today. Thousands of Second Amendment protesters are on the Capitol grounds. So far, it's been peaceful. And I hope it continues that way.
Me too.
Indeed.
Me too.
Okay.
All right, then. We'll see y'all. Y'all take
See you
care.
next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.